Are you ready for Jonah Part 2? The scheme has been that we've dealt with these prophets, and the first week we've dealt with what does that message, how does that relate to us today? And then the second week we deal with the message and how that impacted Jesus, and that's what we're doing today with Jonah. And for us to remember that the exilic prophets during the exile, they had a cause, and they interpreted that cause. And certainly the story of Jonah, there was a cause behind that, that God was the God of all people, even the people in Nineveh. But Jesus took these causes of the exilic prophets and made it a way of life for him and his ministry and his life and his death. And so it's always important to review what happened between the time that Jonah's story was told and became prominent in the tradition of the Hebrew people and Jesus' life. And two incredibly important shifts took place during these centuries. First of all, the once cherished dream of Judah and Israel becoming a powerful political empire, competing with other empires for the control of the Fertile Crescent and the Jordan Valley. And this dream that they had of being a powerful political entity was made possible, you'll remember, because they believed that Jehovah was on their side and therefore guaranteed that they would seize control and reign in that area of the world. But, you know, that cherished dream had vanished. When Jesus was born and raised in that Jewish heritage, that dream had vanished. They had gone through all the empires, all the different empires, and now they were under Rome. And that cherished dream of being a political, forceful entity had vanished. The other thing that had happened is that for the first time there was some admittance that they had been influenced significantly by each empire. And to the extent that for several generations before Jesus' life, the Hebrew nation had accommodated themselves to the Roman Empire. They weren't fighting it. They accommodated their life. They compromised themselves to the expectations of the Roman Empire, to the extent that, as we've mentioned before, in 90 AD, when the Hebrew library was put together, the scribes and the leaders at that time said, we aren't going to include any book that was written after this contamination took place. After we accommodated ourselves to the Roman Empire, we have tainted our own life to the extent that any of the books written about our life after they had accommodated themselves to the Roman Empire, they weren't going to be included. That's the reason why we have the Apocrypha, the set of books between the two testaments, is because they felt like they had been contaminated, they had been tainted, and therefore, as Jesus' ministry began, they were no longer a nation competing with other nations, and they had been contaminated by their compromising to the expectations of the Roman Empire. So here's Jesus out of this tradition, and these shifts had taken place. And so therefore, when we look at Jonah's influence on Jesus, it's almost as if it was no longer an issue. It was just an assumption. The meaning of the story of Jonah, that the people in Nineveh were just as important to God as the people in Palestine. Now think through that. That was no longer an issue. So Jonah is almost a foundation for Jesus, an assumption in Jesus' ministry. And we could rattle off a lot of assumptions, but let me just share 3 assumptions that Jesus had in his ministry that were just straight out of the powerful story of the book of Jonah. First of all, monotheism. That was a given for Jesus. There was one God, his Father of all. Secondly, the call of Jonah was the same as the call to Jesus, and that is to express the love of God for all. No restrictions, no barriers, no fences. The love of God for all. That was a call of God to Jonah, call of God to Jesus. And finally, theocracy was not an option for Jesus. Theocracy is a God-determined political partisanship that God is really the emperor and God will rule a nation. And that simply was not on the table. And so we look at Jonah as being a foundation, if you will, a cornerstone for Jesus' ministry as we consider these implications. Now, these 3 emphases illustrate how it was a cornerstone for Jesus' ministry. And the references I'm going to use today are from the Gospel according to Luke. Now, that's very important because let's recall, Mark was written first, and it was just the story of Jesus' life. Matthew followed, and it is placed first in the New Testament to sort of be the bridge from the Old Testament, because Matthew was written to convince Jews, Hebrews, to be followers of Jesus. Luke was written about the same time as Matthew with a different audience, the Gentiles. And so we have so many illustrations in Luke of Jonah's influence because Luke was writing to the people, if you will, all of the Ninevehs of the world, whether it be the nearby Samaritans or the close by Edomites or whoever it might be. It made no difference to Jesus. And so we look at the Gospel of Luke, and I picked out just 3 themes, and I don't know how many there could be, of looking at how Jonah was the cornerstone of Jesus' ministry. But the first one is, God is a merciful God. And that just, we assume that, but it wasn't assumed in Jesus' day. And we look at Luke 10:13. Woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the miracles had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, which occurred in you, they would have repented a long time ago, sitting in sackcloth and ashes. But it will be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon in the judgment than for you. Sackcloth and burlap. Remember Nineveh? When the people repented, they clothed themselves and the animals in burlap and sackcloth. So God is a merciful God. The great commandment in Luke 10:25, love your God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbors yourself. It didn't say except for. It didn't say now you have the following restrictions on this. That was a blanket commandment that God's love, God's mercy is for all. No restrictions, no fences, no human alignment of differences could stand in the way of the great commandment for all. And therefore, the first theme of Jesus' ministry that we pick up just straight out of Jonah is God is a merciful God for all. Now that's important, because the idea that God is a merciful God is not new. You can find that. But it was also always God is a merciful God for those who love God, for those who are like us, for those who are chosen. But no, not for Jesus. The great commandment was God is a merciful God for all. Secondly, as a way of life for Jesus, the arrogance of Jonah was replaced by humility. Jesus' way of life was one of humility. The story in Luke 9:46, and an argument arose among them as to which of them might be the greatest. You talk about an arrogant-based question. Who is the greatest? But Jesus, knowing what they were thinking in their heart, took a child and stood by him at his side, and he said to them, whoever receives this child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me. For he who is least among you, this is the one who is great. Jesus had so many illustrations in his life of humility rather than arrogance. Indeed, in Luke 14, and again we find all of these in the gospel according to Luke. They're so prominent. And this is when he began speaking a parable to the invited guests, when he noticed how they had been picking out the places of honor at the table, saying to them, the head table, the whole head table, which I personally detest. When you're invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you may have been invited by him. And he who has invited you both shall come and say to you, give place to this person, and then in disgrace you proceed to occupy the last place. But when you are invited, go and recline at the last place, so that when the one who is inviting you comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will have honor in the sight of all who ate at the table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself shall be exalted. How about Jonah sitting under the shade tree, and the shade tree is taken away, and he has a pity party? Why? Because of arrogance, thinking of himself as more important than the Ninevites. Jesus had a way of life of humility. My best description of humility is that one who is humble doesn't look up to anyone, doesn't look down to anybody, but has horizontal vision. And Jesus was a person of horizontal vision with a child, with one who had broken the commandments, with a thief on another cross. Didn't look down, didn't look up, horizontally looked at the other and accepted that person in love. Jesus replaced the arrogance of Jonah with the lifestyle of humility. That's the way he lived. That's the way he died. But finally, and probably the most obvious, is that forgiveness is the heart of discipleship. In Luke 9, the question of Jesus about forgiveness, how many times do you forgive? And Jesus said 70 times 70, which in Hebrew numerology is infinity. You just keep on forgiving. Don't count. Don't wonder when you begin or when you end. You forgive. And you take that word apart, and it means giving for another. Being for another. That's what forgive means. Give for another, regardless of their circumstances. In prison, hungry, or in good stead and wealthy, we're called to give ourselves for the other. And of course, that was a way of life for Jesus. And we have so many illustrations in Luke how Jesus forgave the woman who'd taken in adultery, and the men of the community had the right to stone her to death. Jesus simply said, I forgive you. So we have these three themes of Jesus' life. God is a God of mercy for all. Arrogance is replaced by humility. And for you and me, forgiveness is the heart of discipleship, following Jesus. And so, to put it mildly, Jonah had a significant influence on Jesus because it became the very cornerstone of his life and teachings. Now I'll leave you with some questions. I'll make a statement and then ask a question. Going to Nineveh was penetrating a human-made boundary, an empire of people. What human-made boundaries exist today which restrict God's mercy? Secondly, humility is acting as a sent servant of love rather than cherishing positions and privileges of being chosen. The question is, what are illustrations today of cherished positions and privileges which must be dismantled for humility to reign? Finally, if forgiveness is giving for another rather than judging another, how can we give for another without approving or blessing what another says or what another does? Let me repeat that, because I think that's a troubling question for all of us. Because we think sometimes forgiving means we approve of what another has done or said. But the question is, how can we forgive another without approving or blessing what that person has done or what that person has said? Questions for us as we think about Jesus, the one we choose to follow. We'll look forward to Sunday.